let me address the elephant in the room with that. You remember we introduced this series, So Will I, Changing the Way You Worship. And I said, this is not going to be a series about how we worship. This is going to be a series about who we worship and why we worship. Well, some of you, for the last 5 minutes, have been sitting there going, well, that was less than honest. And that because I hope you wouldn't say that I lied, but some of you might have been thinking that too. But you're thinking, wait a minute now, I thought we weren't going to talk about how we worship, and here you are talking about how we worship. We're supposed to be talking about who we worship and why we worship. And what I said specifically was, we're going to talk more about who we worship, and we're going to talk more about why we worship than we are about how we worship. And honestly, I did not want that announcement to be in this series. I've kind of fought against it, but I understand why our leadership says, no, you need to go ahead and put it out on the table and let's talk about it. So I understand that, and I can respect that, but I don't want that to distract, because, yeah, that's a little bit about how we worship, but that's surface level stuff, honestly. It is. When I think about the question of how we worship, I'm thinking about how do we respond to God. I mean, what we've been talking about, and I've tried really hard in this series to say, let's make this about God. Who is God? Why is He worthy of our worship? What is worship? Worship is a response to God, both personal and corporate, for who He is and what He's done, expressed in and by the things we say and the way we live. So that's what we've been talking about this entire series. Worship is our response to God. And so we worship Him because He made us to worship. We worship Him because He is worthy of our worship. We worship Him because He has invited us into His presence. I mean, this is you can't, there are no adequate words to describe it, that the God of the universe has invited us into His presence, that He is calling us into His presence to worship Him. And we can't wrap our minds around that thing. And, you know, that's exactly what I want to talk about in this series is who is He and how do we respond? Because it's one thing to say God has invited us into His presence, but at some point we have to ask, but what does that look like? What does it look like to come before God and worship? And I'm not talking worship style there. Our worship style will change. It will always change. I know some of you probably like the style we've got now, and you think, oh, we can just leave it this way for the rest of my life. That will not happen because styles change. We've probably been through half a dozen different worship styles at this church since I've been here. And if you love what we're doing now, well, guess what? It's going to change. If you hate what we're doing now, guess what? It's going to change. I tell people all the time, if you don't like something at Murray Hills, hang around. We'll change it in 2 or 3 years. So, I mean, that's going to happen because styles change. Somebody was talking to me this week and said, we're looking for a new church, and we visited your church. It wasn't really it, but we're trying to find a church that sings hymns, and we can't find any. Okay, and I know some of you want to sing hymns, okay? I understand that. But what they're saying is we can't find a church that sings hymns. And what they're saying is we can't find a church that does it kind of in the old way that we were used to. Most of them seem to be going this contemporary worship. Well, I think that's a good decision. I think it's a good decision. I mean, nobody worships with organs much anymore. I know a few do, but not many churches worship with organs much anymore because none of us listen to organ music on the radio, right? We only listen to that when we go to horse shows, and most of us don't go to horse shows anymore either. So the styles change, and as the style changes, the church changes with it. So when we talk about how we respond to God, we're not talking about whether we use guitars or pianos. We're not talking about whether we sing with a choir or sing with a praise team. Not talking about whether we use hymnals or project it on the screen. That's surface level stuff. That's preference, that choice. Yeah, our shepherds have to make some decisions and say, we think this style best fits our church, or we think this style best helps us reach new people. We think this style best helps us connect with God. But I'm talking about how do we respond to an invitation like this? And I was supposed to close last week's message with this verse, and I forgot. I don't know. I got to preaching, and I just forgot. But I was supposed to close with this. It says, because of Christ and our faith in Him, we can now come boldly and confidently into God's presence. And here's the other one. Hebrews chapter 4. This one was supposed to be in last week's message too. Let us then approach God's throne of grace with confidence so that we may receive mercy and find grace to help us in our time of need. So God's inviting us into His throne room. God is inviting us into His presence. How do we do that? Like, what does that look like? How do we respond to God? How do we come before the presence of God? Do we come before the presence of God with our eyes closed and our heads bowed? Do we come before the presence of God with our chins held high and our arms up in the air? Do we come before the presence of God in singing? Do we come before the presence of God in prayer? Do we come before the presence of God in communion? Do we come before the presence in this reverent fear? Do we come with fear and trembling on our knees, bowing before Him? Or do we come before Him lifting up our arms and fist pumping like the kid he was talking about? Do we come before God in celebration? Or do we come before God in quietness and stillness? Yes. Yes, that's how we come before God. We do all of those things as we come before God. The psalmist put it this way in chapter 2, verse 11. Serve the Lord with reverent fear and rejoice with trembling. In the New International Version, it says celebrate. So it talks about these twin themes of come before the Lord with reverence and with celebration. Jesus talked about in John 14, a time is coming when you will worship God in both spirit and truth. And so God says, I want you to come before me with everything you got. Yes, I want you to come before me in spirit. And yes, I want you to come before me in truth. And yes, I want you to come before me in reverence. And yes, I want you to do it in celebration. The problem is churches have a real hard time balancing that. And we have a real hard time balancing that. Because typically what happens is the church kind of swings to one pendulum or the other. And there's people that feel, the church historically has, if they kind of focus on the truth and say, we've got to be a church that's focused on the truth. And so it's more about retaining knowledge and it's more about hearing information about God, and that's how we connect with God. Or we've said, no, it's about expressing yourself emotionally and it's about feeling something. I don't want to just come to worship just to think something. I want to come to worship to feel something. And Jesus says, I want you to do both in worship. I want you to think something. I want you to think about me. I also want you to feel something about me. And Jeff Deo, in his book, Awakening Pure Worship, says this: while both of these approaches stem from biblical teaching, each is fruitless apart from the other. Now look at this right here. Here we go. For if we imagine we have truth but are without spirit, the result is a dead religion. Likewise, if we imagine we have spirit but are without truth, the result is empty emotion. Both are utterly lifeless apart from the other, yet both are abundantly life-giving when intermingled. That's what God is inviting us into. God is inviting us to think something. God is inviting us to feel something. God's inviting us to worship in spirit and in truth. Or the way that I thought of it this week is God's inviting us to worship Him with all our heart, with all our soul, with all our mind, and with all our strength, our bodies. God is inviting us to worship Him in all of those ways, because Jesus said, when they said, what's the most important command? Jesus said, well, sing with an organ. That's the most important command. Or, what's the most important command? Use hymnals. That's most important. What's the most important command? You got choirs. I love choirs. I just wish more churches would use choirs. No. The most important command is just love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, strength, and mind, regardless of how you worship. Just love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, strength, and mind. And so Jeff Deo does this, and I love this right here. Okay, he asked this question. I'll give you a multiple choice test, all right? And it's going to seem easy at first, but it's really not. And he asked it this way: of all the ways that we respond to God, what is the most effective way to respond to God in worship? When we come to worship, how should we most effectively respond to God? A, with all our hearts. B, with all our soul. C, with all our mind. Or D, with all our strength. What's the most effective way to do that? And I know you're looking at it going, there's not enough choices on there. We need an E. I'll make it even funner than that. I'll give you an E, F, and a G. E, both A and C, with all our hearts and with all our minds. And don't you hate when teachers do this on the multiple choice test? I hate those. F, both B and D, with all our soul and strength. Or G, all of the above. Now, the answer's obvious in theory, but not in practice. Because in practice, what we do is we tend to choose based upon our personalities and our comfort level and our preferences and kind of how we were raised, the churches we grew up in. That's kind of how we choose how we're going to respond to God. So, for example, if we're kind of a reserved person emotionally, if we're rather reserved, we're going to choose E, both A and C, and we're going to say worship is eternal. Worship is worship's in the heart. That's what worship is about, and it's in the mind. And so when I come to worship God, I'm worshiping God with all of my heart and with all of my mind. This is an eternal response to God, not a visible response to God. You don't have to see it. You can't see worshiping happening in me while we're worshiping. If you're a more expressive person, if you're more emotionally expressive, you're probably going to say B and D. You can't hide that. You can't hide worship of God. You got to worship God with all your soul. You got to bare your soul before God, and you got to worship God with all your strength, which means you got to raise your hands. I mean, you got to let that stuff out. That's worship is external. Now, I think it's pretty obvious if you've been around Murray Hills any length of time, the difference between myself and Scott when it comes to questions like this, right? I think if we were going to pick our preferences, I think I would probably be both A and C. I would say, well, I worship God in my heart and I worship God in my mind, and I raise hands once every 3 or 4 years, but I generally don't. And I've tried a few times kind of breaking out of that comfort, but I generally don't. And a lot of that's background. A lot of that's just personality. I'm just generally not, real emotional expressive. That doesn't mean I'm not worshiping. Now, Scott, on the other hand, we got to tone him down every now and then. Because, he's worshiping with all your soul and with all your strength. And there was a beautiful example of it 2 or 3 Sundays ago when I messed up the closing song. I was ending the message and I was just talking about God. So I was trying to talk about who God was, and I wanted to invite the band back up, and they're going to do a closing song. As I'm talking about God, I'm talking in the way that I would talk right now. You've never seen me get too crazy up here, right? I'm just talking. I'm talking in my normal tone of voice. I'm just, explaining who God is and why that's important. And I did not know this at the time. You did. I didn't. But Scott was behind me, like cheering me on while this is happening. I tried to catch a picture of it on YouTube. But you catch that little, like Scott's back there going, doing that. He's back there cheering me on while I'm talking quietly and calmly about God. He's back there expressing himself. And when I went back and saw it on video, I thought, what a beautiful picture of the kingdom of God. That's what it's supposed to be like. That's what it's supposed to be like. And God's calling us to worship Him with our whole person. And so that means people like me are going to have to get out of our comfort level sometime. We're going to have to break out of our comfort zone just a little bit and maybe raise a hand every now and then. We're going to have to, because God's calling for that. And that means people like Scott are going to have to break out of their comfort zone, put them down sometimes. And just worship in your mind. But that's what it's supposed to be like. I don't judge Scott for his worship. He doesn't judge me for my worship. And that's what we've got to do as a church. You don't judge other people for their work. I know sometimes those of us who aren't expressive look at people who are expressive and say, I just don't, that's just all for show. I just don't, why are they doing that? I just wish they wouldn't do that. Well, close your eyes. Seriously, I'm serious. Close your eyes. You don't have to watch it. And those of us who are expressive, we start looking at people that don't do it, and they're like, what's the matter with them? They're just dead. They're not worshiping God. Well, close your eyes. That'll solve all of our worship problem. Everybody close your eyes. And we're like, well, we can't. Scott introduces so many new songs, we don't know the words. So, I'm sorry, Scott. That was not in the notes. That was just an extra. It was an extra. Listen, God's calling us to worship Him with our whole person. He's calling us to worship with all our hearts, with all our mind, with all our soul, and with all our strength. Can you imagine what would happen at this church if we took Him up on the offer? Can you imagine what would happen if we did it? Can you imagine what would happen to our singing? Or can you imagine what would happen to our prayers? Or can you imagine what would happen to our giving? Or can you imagine what would happen to our serving? To going out in the community. If we just took Him up on the offer and said, God, I'm willing to worship You with absolutely everything I've got. That awakening I was talking about last week, that's what I think it's about. It's not about styles and volume of music and all those things. That awakening is just in our hearts and minds and souls and strength, being awakening to God's presence and saying, oh my goodness, the Almighty of the universe is calling me to worship Him. I should do so. If the stars were made to worship, so will I. Next week. I'll finally explain what this series is about next week. Let's pray together, and we're going to dismiss. God, I'm so thankful.